Okay, let's go ahead and get started. My name is Nisha Ramachandran. I am the chair of Desis for Progress. So thank you all for joining us this evening. We are very excited to put together this event in honor and celebration of Black History Month, to really get a better sense of how our communities, both South Asian and Black communities, are have an interconnected history that we're going to learn a little bit more about. For many of you that have been to Desis for Progress events before, we are very much aware that we have had conversations around anti-Blackness for some years now, so this is very much part of that, and is something that is certainly of importance to us, continuing to address how we tackle anti-Blackness in the Desi community. And so this is a part of that conversation, and it's a conversation that will continue through this year and through years in the future. So with that, I know we have a lot to get through this evening, and so I want to just remind all of you to please feel free to put your questions into the chat box. There will be time for Q&A at the end, and so please feel free to use that chat box so that we can get your questions in that way. Before we begin, I just want to say thank you again to Samip, Mallick, to Rochelle Faithful, and to Suruchi, Keenheel, who are our panelists today, and we're so excited to have them all with us. We are recording this session, as you may know. We cannot guarantee that we'll post it, just given what may end up becoming more of a sensitive conversation. So we'll keep everyone posted on that afterwards. Finally, I just want to thank you all again for your support, and I will turn it over to Joy Dhar. She is a board member of Desis for Progress and is the moderator of today's event. So with that, thanks so much, and enjoy the event.
All right. Thank you, Nisha, and thanks everyone for being here, both in panelist view as well as in the participant channel. So the first thing I want to do is send, we were unable to get in contact with the captioner that we had assigned for this particular event. So I want to send a link to the Otter document that we are using to provide as a backup transcription source for this event. Please let us know in the chat if it's not working, and we'll work to troubleshoot something. But if we do end up recording this session, we'll be able to produce a transcript from that as well, should that not be working. So apologies for that, but we will try a workaround. Okay, so with that, I would like to thank everyone for being here again and start with reading the bios of our wonderful panelists and presenters. Rochelle Faithful uses they, them, theirs pronouns and is a multidisciplinary folk healing artist and healing justice practitioner rooted in the African diasporic tradition of conjure. They were born in Washington, D.C. and raised in Virginia with a strong family affinity to their Southern family line in Georgia, Alabama, and Texas. Faithful supports national and local activists of all backgrounds, particularly leaders of Black liberation movements. They are known for creating spaces to help activists identify and process trauma and invest into healing justice frameworks. Their work has been featured in national publications, including in Color Lines, The Root, Everyday Feminism, HuffPost, among others. They also publish their own words in several books and law review articles. Welcome, Rochelle. Our next speaker / panelist is Samip Mallick. He is the co-founder and executive director of SAADA, which for the last 12 years has worked to document, preserve, and share stories from the South Asian American community. At a time while the role of immigration in American society is being questioned, SAADA's work serves as a powerful response to the questions of who belong. Working at the intersection of technology and storytelling, Mallick has a bachelor's in computer science and a master's degree in library and information sciences. Prior to his work with SAADA, Mallick was the director of a Center for Digital Information on South Asia at the University of Chicago Library. Welcome, Samip. Finally, I would like to introduce Suruchi Keenheel, who is the Director of Instructional Coaching and Training at AIM Institute for Learning and Research. In that role, she oversees professional development programming and evidence-based literacy instructions for educators and school administrators. She began her career in Washington, D.C., where she taught reading, writing, and mathematics in K through 6th grades and designed and implemented the first inclusive special education program in the school's history. In 2009, Suruchi had the unique opportunity to be on the founding team of a public charter school in West Philadelphia. She started out as the coordinator for special education interventions and assessments, and later took on the role of assistant principal. She also founded and leads South Asians in Solidarity with Black Lives, a group whose mission is to fight anti-Blackness and engage in active allyship by examining our role in racist structures and working to dismantle them. Welcome, Suruchi. All right. Well, now that I have introduced all of our stellar panelists, I will turn it over to Samip, who will be sharing a presentation on SAADA's behalf.
Joy, thank you so much. Everyone, my name is Samip Mallick. I'm the co-founder and executive director of SAADA, the South Asian American Digital Archive, as Joy mentioned. And before I get started, I just want to thank all of you for spending some time out of your evening to be with us here today. And also want to thank Joy and Nisha and the whole Desis for Progress team for setting up this conversation and inviting me to be part of it. And definitely want to thank Rochelle and Suruchi for being in conversation with me, and really looking forward to the dialogue today. So just to give you some, I'll start by just sharing my screen, and as with always on Zoom, there's just like a pause to make sure that this works. Hopefully it will work. Here it goes. So a little bit more background on SAADA. SAADA, as I mentioned, is a nonprofit organization based in Philadelphia, which is where I live, but one that works nationally to collect and share stories from the South Asian American community. And I'm going to be sharing some stories and materials from the archive in my presentation today. And so I created just a page on the SAADA website where you can access these resources if you want to learn more about anything that I share today. It's saada.org/Desis for Progress. I'm going to start by sharing a quote with you. This is a quote that I often share in relationship to SAADA's work because it's really been so central to how I think about the importance of the work that SAADA does. It's a quote from a scholar of archival studies named Jeanette Bastien. And what Jeanette Bastien's research looks at is really what impact it has for communities to not have access to their own histories, to their own historical records. And here's what she says. She says, a community without its records is a community under siege, defending itself, its identity, and its version of history without a firm foundation on which to stand. So we started SAADA 12 years ago, almost going on 13 years ago now, really recognizing that our community, the South Asian American community, like many communities that have been historically marginalized and excluded, we haven't had access to our own histories, to our own historical records. But it's not just our communities in isolation, it's also our community's histories of connection with other communities of color. And certainly it's those stories that I'll be sharing with you in my presentation today. After George Floyd was murdered this past summer, and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and too many others, I think many in our community were heartened to see South Asians standing in solidarity in the struggle against anti-Black racism. For example, in Minneapolis, the restaurant owners whose restaurant was burned to the ground in the uprising after George Floyd was murdered, writing very powerfully on Facebook, "Don't worry about us. We will rebuild and we will recover." This is Hafsa, Ruhel's daughter, writing. As I'm sitting next to my dad watching the news, I hear him say on the phone, quote, "Let my building burn. Justice needs to be served. Put those officers in jail." Gandhi Mahal, which is the name of the restaurant, may have felt the flames last night, but our fiery drive to help protect and stand with our community will never die. Peace be with everyone. Justice for George Floyd. Black Lives Matter. And Rahul Dubey, a South Asian community member in Washington, D.C., who opened his home to protesters in D.C. who were being tear gassed and attacked by the police there, and really spoke very about his role, the small role that he played in really helping the protesters there. And of course, the critical work that organizations like South Asians for Black Lives and Equality Labs are doing to support Black-led movements, including Black Lives Matter. But I think, certainly we're heartened to know these stories from this past year, but when we know our history, we know that the work that we are doing today is actually part of a long lineage of South Asians recognizing that our struggles are fundamentally and inextricably linked to Black struggles in the fight against anti-Black racism. And so I'm going to share a few of those stories with you today from the archive that I think will help illustrate that. And the first story that I want to share with you in particular is a story from 1941 that was written about by Professor Nico Slate in his book, Colored Cosmopolitanism, which highlights these histories of interconnectedness. And so I'm going to read a couple paragraphs from this book just to give you a sense of the story. In the spring of 1941, in the midst of the Second World War, Kamladevi Chattopadhyay sat down in the, quote, whites-only section of a segregated train traveling through the American South. Just across the Louisiana border, the ticket collector ordered her to move. She asked him, why? But that is the rule, he replied, and you better obey it or you will regret it. She did not move. He walked away angrily, but soon returned, subdued, it seemed, by something he had learned. He asked her where she was from, making clear that he realized she was not African American. New York, she said evasively. I mean, which land do you hail from? He clarified. At this point, she could have proudly explained that she was a distinguished visitor from India, a colleague of Mahatma Gandhi and a champion of Indian independence and the rights of Indian women, and that she had only a few months before had tea with Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. Instead, when prompted to tell the man from which land she came, Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay replied, it makes no difference. I am a colored woman, obviously, and it's unnecessary for you to disturb me here, for I have no intention of moving. The ticket collector muttered, you are an Asian, but he did not bother her again. By refusing to move, Kamaladevi defied the legalized bigotry of the American South. By proclaiming herself colored, she expressed solidarity with the millions of African Americans for whom the brutalities of segregation were a part of daily life. This was more than a fleeting gesture. Kamaladevi understood that the efforts of African Americans were crucial to a global struggle against racism and imperialism, a struggle that she framed in terms of color. Her self-definition as a colored woman epitomized a colored cosmopolitanism that transcended traditional racial distinctions, positioning Indians and African Americans together at the vanguard of the, quote, darker races. Articulated most eloquently by W.E.B. Du Bois, colored cosmopolitanism appealed to those working to forge a united front against racism, imperialism, and other forms of oppression. So in my presentation today, there are three things generally that I'd like to share. The first is that I'd like to provide some context for our community's history in order to place us in the racial history of the United States, a story that I think too few of us in our community know well. The second is to demonstrate, as Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay's story does, the long lineage of solidarity and allyship between South Asians and Black communities. And the third is to discuss some hard, but I think necessary truths that demonstrate the work that needs to be done within our community today to truly work to move forward in any meaningful and honest way. So first, I'd like to provide some context on the South Asian American community and its history. South Asians first began arriving in the United States in larger numbers, beginning in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And those who were coming at that time were coming primarily to work as laborers. So they're working on farms, fields, lumber yards, mills, factories, etc., and primarily settling on the west coast of the United States in California, Oregon, Washington State, as well as the western parts of Canada. And they were also coming primarily from the Punjab region of British India. As you know, until 1947, India and what is now modern day Pakistan and Bangladesh were all a British territory, British colony. There were smaller numbers of individuals who were able to come for other reasons. So this, for example, is a photograph from 1914 of members of the Illinois chapter of the Hindustan Association of America. This is an organization that, much like a South Asian Students Association of today, would basically help to acclimate students to life in the United States who are here from South Asia. There were very, very few South Asian women and families that were allowed into the United States during this early period of immigration, the late 1800s and early 1900s, because of very restrictive immigration policy. And this is a newspaper article from 1915 describing the arrival of one of the very few South Asian women allowed into the country. Her name was Kala Bagai. And it was such a big deal in San Francisco that there was this newspaper article in the San Francisco Chronicle talking about her arrival. But once again, practically ignores her. The title, as you can see, is Nose Diamond, Latest Fad, Arrives Here from India. The reality that these early immigrants faced was one of incredible xenophobia and racism and bigotry. This is an article from 1906 As you can see, it's titled Our First Invasion by Hindus and Mohammedans. And another from 1907 titled Have We a Dusky Peril? Hindu Hordes Invading the state of Washington in this case. A quick note about the term Hindu that's being used again and again here. That term Hindu was actually being used as a racial classification, not a religious classification as we would think about it today. So anyone who was here from South Asia who was brown, whether they be religiously Hindu or Muslim or Sikh, would often be called Hindu in the American context. And it was, I should note, primarily Punjabi Sikh men who were coming to the United States at this time. So just a few months after this article was published in Bellingham, Washington in 1907, there was a white mob that gathered in this town and violently chased out of this town the group of Punjabi laborers who had settled there. And this also touched off other anti-immigrant violence in other parts of Washington, in Oregon, California, as well as in British Columbia. This xenophobia was also reflected in Congress. And in 1917, US Congress passed the 1917 Immigration Act, which effectively drew a line around South Asia and parts of Southeast Asia, the section in red that you see here, and barred immigration from those parts of the world to the United States. And I think it's remarkable and striking to note that it was almost exactly 100 years to the day after this 1917 act was passed that former President Trump, it gives me great joy to say former, President Trump signed the first executive order Muslim ban in 2017. So really thinking about the ways that these histories of xenophobia and racism continue to this day, and the striking ways that there are such parallels between what was happening 100 years ago and what's happening today. This all came to a head in the South Asian American context in 1923 with a Supreme Court decision, United States v. Bhagat Singh Thind, where it was decided on racial grounds, because we're not white, that South Asians should be barred from becoming American citizens. This is an article from 1923 from the Literary Digest that describes the Supreme Court decision. You can see it's titled Hindus Too Brunette to Vote Here. And there's a photograph of a South Asian man with a caption that simply reads, quote unquote, the problem. So that gives you a sense of the ethos in this country at that time. And I'll be mentioning this Thind decision a couple times throughout my presentation. It's a very pivotal moment for the community, so just keep that in mind. And this was the law of the land for the next quarter century, basically, until finally, after years and years of campaigning by the community, in 1946, South Asians were once again allowed to become American citizens. And they raised the quota, allowing up to 100 South Asians to enter the United States per year. But really, it was only in 1965, in the midst of the Civil Rights Movement, that South Asians were able to come to the United States in larger numbers, including my parents. And I would suspect, many of you on the meeting today, either your families or yourself. It's really a result of the 1965 Immigration Nationality Act. And once again, that act really was only made possible due to the leadership and activism of the Civil Rights Movement led by Black Americans. And so in very tangible and real ways, I think that our communities have been connected since the very beginning days of the South Asian presence in the United States. And in very real ways, we own our very tangible existence in this country to the struggles against anti-Black racism led by Black communities. Often people think of this as a historical indebtedness, but I would actually suggest that we think of this as a historical interconnectedness. Our struggles have been, they are now, and they will always be linked to the liberation of Black people and Black communities. And so I want to delve into that a little bit deeper now and share a couple stories with you from the archive that help to illustrate that a little bit further. The first story that I want to share with you is actually from a walking tour that we have of Philadelphia called Revolution Remix. It's a walking tour that starts at the Liberty Bell, and for those who know Philadelphia, kind of winds its way around Old City, and it ends at Race Street Pier on the banks of the Delaware River. This is a map that shows you the sites on the tour, and this is a photograph from the very last stop on the tour at Race Street Pier. And in this tour, we share stories of South Asian Americans in these spaces that most people think of as basically old white guys in powdered wigs from the 1780s all the way up to the present day. So hundreds of years of South Asian American history in Philadelphia that most people, even within our community certainly, don't know anything about. We also got a grant from the Pew Center for Arts and Heritage to work with 5 contemporary South Asian American musicians to create a soundtrack to this walking tour, which we premiered at a concert at Christchurch Neighborhood House in historic Philadelphia in August of 2019. And so I'm going to share one of the stories from the tour, but before I do, I actually wanted to share an experience that we had on the very first time that we were leading this tour. We were actually standing on this map at site 3, which is at the corner of 6th and Arch. It's the site of the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania, one of the very few places in the world in the late 1800s where a woman could earn a medical degree. And so it was a place that Anandibai Joshi, a young Indian woman, came in 1883 to earn her degree in Western medicine. And she graduated in 1886, becoming the first woman anywhere in the world, first South Asian woman anywhere in the world to earn a medical degree. And so the very first time we did this tour, we were, we had invited some of our board members and our advisors and volunteers to come as a kind of practice run for the tour. And we were standing at this corner feeling, and quite frankly, just really connected with ourselves, with our histories, with each other. And as we're standing at this corner sharing these histories from 200 years ago, a car stopped at the intersection. Two white men are in the car. They roll down their window and they yell a pro-Trump slogan at us. And this is something that has stayed with me for a couple of years. I mean, at the moment, it was so awkward. We just kind of laughed it off, feeling very confused about why that happened. But the more I thought about it, the more it really occurred to me how threatening it is to see a group of South Asian people standing, learning their own histories in the way that their histories are fundamentally connected to the story of the city of Philadelphia. And to those who are deeply invested in white supremacy, how threatening that is. And so I've taken a lot of pride in the work that we've done with this walking tour to write South Asian American histories into the city of Philadelphia's history. So this story that I'm going to share with you now actually takes place at site number 2, which is, once again, for those who know Philadelphia, on 7th Street, just south of Market Street. It's site 2 on this map. So undoubtedly, many of you have heard about Bose speakers or Bose headphones, and perhaps you're even wearing Bose headphones right now, but many people are very surprised to learn that Bose was actually a company that was started by a South Asian American who grew up here in Philadelphia in the early 20th century. The founder of Bose was a Philadelphia native named Amar Gopal Bose, born here on November 2nd, 1929, to an Indian man and a white American woman. And Bose's accounts of growing up in Philadelphia in the 1930s, before becoming a successful business person, paint a picture of the racial tensions which were part of the daily life back then, and which continue to be today. Amar Gopal Bose's father, Noni Gopal Bose, I'll call him Bose Sr. for the sake of shorthand, was a Bengali freedom fighter who had been involved with revolutionary groups in India while he was still a student at Calcutta University. But when he realized British officials were after him, he escaped to the US without a passport and with just $5 in his pockets. Bose Sr. arrived in Philadelphia and established an import business here. The office space he used was right next to Declaration House on the southwest corner of 7th and Market, which is where Thomas Jefferson and Bob Hennings, an enslaved Black man, resided in 1776 while Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. In addition to his import business, Bose Sr. also became involved with the Ghadar Party, an organization that had been founded in San Francisco in 1913 to liberate India from British colonial rule through armed revolution. Bose Sr.'s job was to mobilize moral and material support for India's struggle for independence. He married a white school teacher named Charlotte, and they settled down in Philadelphia. And Bose Jr., the founder of Bose Corporation, Bose Audio, recounts that there would often be hush-hush meetings of Ghadar Party activists in their home. But the idealism and urgency which the Bose family held was soured by the realities of racism in this city. After the Great Migration of the 1920s, when millions of Black Americans moved out of the South and headed north for jobs, the population in Philadelphia was dramatically changed, and many white residents here were very opposed to that change. Hypersegregation was already a reality at the time of the Great Depression in 1929, and that event only heightened class tensions across racial lines. And this was the context in which the Bose family moved here in the 1930s. As a child, Bose remembers his father telling him stories of struggling to find someone willing to rent them a house in the city. He recalls how they used to enter a restaurant and would be kept waiting without service because of their skin color. On one of those nights, as the family waited patiently to be served, only to be ignored repeatedly by the waiting staff, Bose Sr. began to grow agitated. We can imagine the scene for a moment. In a restaurant filled with white patrons, here sat this person who had arrived with great hope and had even begun building a family here in the US because of that hope. Yet after years of being stifled by instances of racism like this one, he was disheartened and he was frustrated. The Supreme Court had recently denaturalized all South Asian American men and their spouses following the 1923 Thin decision. His home country was still under British rule, and here he was just trying to have a meal with his family, still under the rule of white men. So perhaps he was a bit angry too. Whatever he was feeling, this evening he had had enough. After the restaurant continued to refuse to serve him, he he asked to speak directly to the restaurant owner, standing up for himself and his family. He said, "Sir, we are good enough to cook and wait and serve you. We're good enough to die for this country in the wars, but we are not good enough to pay and be served. Why is that?" And then Bose Sr. led his family out of the restaurant. Amar Gopal Bose's childhood, in comparison to his later fame and fortune, reminds us that there's no one story about our communities. In fact, there isn't even one story to tell about a single family of South Asian Americans. And yet so often there's only a single story that's told about us, one which lumps us all into a single, easily dismissed idea. It is easier and maybe more comfortable for some to think of our community as a monolith, but this hides uncomfortable truths about our past and our present. For example, there are currently over 500,000 undocumented South Asians living in the country today, and 1 in 10 of all South Asian Americans are living in poverty. Looking deeper at stories like Bose's from the past helps us face more of these truths today and builds greater understanding for various South Asian communities, especially those who are most vulnerable in this present moment. So I'd like to share another story with you from the archive now. And through this story, take us a little bit further into an examination of both the historical connections and solidarities between South Asians in the struggle against anti-Black racism, but also, as I said, the work that needs to be done within our community that Desis for Progress and others have been doing to be able to move forward in any kind of honest and meaningful way. In 1930, a South Asian immigrant published a vicious letter in the Chicago Defender, penned under the name K. Romola, dismissing any possible solidarity between African Americans and South Asians. This is what he wrote, quote, "Too much has been written by Black newspapers, magazines, and forthright writers like Du Bois about the darker races. But who in the hell wants to join the caravan with the Black ones? Our caste system in India excludes those who do not belong to the Aryan white race, and we even here exclude any Indians who live and socialize with them." H.G. Mudgal, a South Asian immigrant living in Harlem, wrote a scathing and ferocious response, describing his fellow Indian as a, quote, "out-of-touch snob and self-hating victim of the white propagandists." Romola had, quote, "utterly forgotten the political, social, and economical oppression that India has been subjected to under the British," Mudgal responded. H.G. Mudgal's life and political work was deeply invested in Black causes. He was born in the city of Hubli, in what is now modern-day Karnataka in India, and he arrived in New York in 1920. In 1922, he was hired to work for newspapers founded by the Pan-Africanist Marcus Garvey and his organization in Harlem. And by May of 1930, he had risen in the ranks and began serving as the acting managing editor for the newspaper, a position that he held until for the next few years. Mudgal's writing often stressed the interconnected nature of the African American struggle and worldwide anti-imperialist movements, including in India. The question of whose struggle the South Asian American community chooses to identify with has echoed throughout our history. It was also evident 7 years prior to Romola and Mudgal's correspondence in Bhagat Singh Thinn's argument to the Supreme Court. This once again is that Supreme Court decision that I mentioned a while ago. In making his case, Thind had argued that he should be allowed to retain his American citizenship because as a, quote, "high caste Hindu of full Indian blood, he actually belonged to the Caucasian race. He was therefore white," Thind claimed, and thus should be eligible for citizenship. Thind was following in the logic of Takao Ozawa, a Japanese immigrant who just a few months earlier had argued before the Supreme Court that his skin was just as white as the average white person, and therefore he too should be allowed to become an American citizen. Like Thind, Ozawa lost his case in a unanimous decision because, as Justice George Sutherland concluded, quote, "the term white person is confined to persons of the Caucasian race." And Ozawa, having been born in Japan, was clearly not Caucasian. So that is where Thind began his argument, claiming that he was in fact Caucasian because of the, quote, "purity of his Aryan blood," which according to the outcome in the Ozawa decision should allow him to become a citizen. In his argument, Thind was attempting to use caste segregation as a way to claim racial purity. At one point, Thind's petition describes how the, quote, "high-class Hindu regards the Aboriginal Indian Mongoloid in the same manner as the American regards those who are Black," speaking from a matrimonial standpoint. In his claim to be, quote, "white, Aryan, Caucasian, high caste, and high class," Thind was attempting to disassociate himself from categories that could be understood as non-white. Hence, he contrasts himself with those defined as Aboriginal, Mongoloid, and Black. As the scholar Sucheta Majumdar has argued, such a claim constitutes a racist response to racism. It was also a casteist response to racism. The justices again disagreed with Thind, this time because the word Caucasian was being used in a way differently from how it would be interpreted in accordance with the understanding of the common man. As Ozawa and Thind both learned, there was nothing that they could have said to convince the Supreme Court otherwise, because it was not about scientific analysis or legal arguments. It was about the future of this country and what that future looked like. As Justice Sutherland further explained, quote, "The children of English, French, German, Italian, Scandinavian, and other European parentage quickly merge into the mass of our population and lose the distinctive hallmarks of their European origin. On the other hand, it cannot be doubted that the children born in this country of Hindu parents would retain indefinitely the clear evidence of their ancestry." A couple years later, John Muhammad Ali, a South Asian immigrant in Detroit, also found himself at the receiving end of the same rejection. Wallace Vischer, the US attorney in Detroit, became aware that Ali had naturalized as an American citizen in 1921 and began challenging his citizenship in court. Distancing himself from Thind, Ali argued that even though he was a native of India, his ancestors were Arabians, and based on previous court rulings where Indians claiming to be Afghani and Parsi were eligible for citizenship, he too should be accepted. His ancestors, Ali said, had been, quote, "careful not to intermarry with the native stock of India," and he even provided evidence in court linking his genealogy back 31 generations to the Prophet Muhammad himself. Ali lost as well, and his citizenship was canceled by the court. Embedded in both Thind and Ali's arguments was a claim to racial purity that seems deeply abhorrent today. While critiquing the exclusionary sentiment of the time, Thind and Ali were simultaneously attempting to exploit existing prejudices that they thought they could work in their favor. Thind, for example, was relying on the court's acceptance of him as a high caste Hindu, since the systemization of social hierarchy through caste was looked upon fondly in the United States, with some wealthy white men even going as far as to call themselves the Boston Brahmins. But as the Thind decision teaches us, the strategy of claiming whiteness or using one's religion, caste, gender, or wealth to appeal for acceptance is ultimately a losing one. In fact, it was only in the 1960s, as I've mentioned before, in the midst of the civil rights era led by Black Americans, that South Asians were finally allowed to enter the United States in larger numbers. And like H.G. Mudgal, South Asians worldwide have been drawing inspiration from and collaborating with Black Americans' fight for freedom and justice for centuries. In 1873, Jyoti Rao Phule, a social reformer in Maharashtra, India, began his essay, Gulamgiri, Slavery, with a dedication to American abolitionists. And in 1971, a group called the Dalit Panthers in India declared in their manifesto, "From the Black Panthers, Black power was established. We claim a close relationship with this struggle." So the last story that I'll share with you in brief is a story from Isabel Wilkerson's most recent book, Caste, The Origin of Our Discontents. And this is an excerpt of a story that's linked from the SAADA website that she actually shared in The Guardian. And so there's a link there where you can read the story. But I highlight the story in large part because one of the stories that often many South Asians are very proud of, or proudest of, is how the ways that Dr. Martin Luther King was inspired by Gandhi and Mahatma Gandhi's nonviolent resistance. And I think this story is so important because the story that Wilkerson shares complicates that story in ways that I think are really instructive for how we're thinking about the intersections of racism and casteism today. So I want to share a couple paragraphs of that story with you now. In the winter of 1959, after leading the Montgomery bus boycott that arose from the arrest of Rosa Parks and before the trials and triumphs to come, Martin Luther King Jr. and his wife Coretta landed in India at Palam Airport in New Delhi to visit the land of Mohandas K. Gandhi, the father of nonviolent protest. They were covered in garlands upon arrival, and King told reporters, quote, "To other countries I may go as a tourist, but to India I come as a pilgrim." King had long dreamed of going to India, and they stayed an entire month. King wanted to see for himself the place whose fight for freedom from British rule had inspired the fight for justice in America. He wanted to see the so-called untouchables, the lowest caste in the ancient Indian caste system, whom he had read about and who he had sympathy for, but who had still been left behind after India gained its independence the decade before. He discovered that people in India had been following the trials of his own oppressed people in the US and knew of the bus boycott he had led. Wherever he went, the people on the streets of Bombay and Delhi crowded around him for an autograph. At one point in their trip, King and his wife journeyed to the southern tip of the country, to the city of Trivandrum in the state of Kerala, and visited with the high school students whose families had been untouchables. The principal made the introduction. "Young people," he said, "I would like to present to you a fellow untouchable from the United States of America." King was floored. He had not expected that term to be applied to him. And he was, in fact, put off by it at first. He had just flown in from another continent and dined with the prime minister. He did not see the connection, did not see what the Indian caste system had to do directly with him, did not immediately see why the lowest caste people in India would view him as low caste like themselves, see him as one of them. For a moment, he later recalled, I was a bit shocked and peeved that I would be referred to as an untouchable. But then he began to think about the reality of the lives of the people that he was fighting for. 20 million people consigned to the lowest rank in the US for centuries, still smothering an airtight cage of poverty, quarantined in isolated ghettos, exiled in their own country. And he said to himself, yes, I am an untouchable, and every Black person in the United States of America is an untouchable. In that moment, he realized that the land of the free had imposed a caste system, not unlike the caste system of India, and that he had lived under that system all of his life. It was what lay beneath the forces he was fighting in the United States. So I'll end there, but like I said, if you go to our website, SAADA.org, all the stories that I've shared, all the images and materials are available there, and I'd welcome you. There's so much more there to explore. So please do check it out if you can. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Samip. Excuse me. Excited to be looking at this screen right now, as opposed to reading all your wonderful bios from a screen that was making my neck hurt a little bit. So wonderful to have really a moment to let all of that information sink in. I really do want to maximize the time that we have from everyone on the panel, especially Suruchi and Rochelle. And I'd love to get your feedback. We can start with Rochelle on just initial thoughts. Doesn't need to be everything, but just initial thoughts on the presentation.
Sure, Samip, thank you so much for that presentation. I learned a great deal, especially about some of the solidarity and also just some South Asian history, right? Especially in the earlier part of the century. So I'm excited to go back to your presentation and really take in some of those stories, which were less familiar to me. And I think this is an example about how we can continue to be in shared learning experiences together. I just love, sharing the space together and learn some of these histories. And I think I'm mostly reflecting on, on just the global phenomenon and also some of the unique kind of American export of white supremacy imperialist culture, right? And the ways in which I was just like really struck, especially having a legal background about, this is not the only story. This is also true about many Indigenous people's history of this territory, about the perversity of how the legal system really forced people to trade between citizenship and other kinds of identities that they would otherwise share in solidarity with people of the global majority. So I just really it's like, what a terrible trade to have to try to make to not, to the degree that even assimilation offers any kind of security even, right, in anything. One tangible part of, I think, assimilation for some people is citizenship. So it was really striking to me that was just a very clear choice and an incentive that was being offered to a number of South Asians throughout history, but particularly the case that we looked at. And I really appreciate too, something I was really reflecting on in a way I haven't before, is like I've really appreciated some of the more recent conversations about understanding some of this, shared caste system similarities we have in India and the US. And I that book also by Isabel Wilkerson's on my list. I think I'm really struck about the ways in which they reinforce and replicate each other across borders. And I think I'm really sitting with that of just like, what does it mean to have different caste identities and different migration histories coming to the US, and having to make these choices, right, that are really incentivized by real benefits in the US about whether to be in solidarity or not. And then what does it mean for like Dr. King to be in India and not initially see that kind of shared connection and try to distance himself, right? So that's really striking to me right now, and I think that's what I'm reflecting on at the moment.
All right, thank you. Suruchi, go ahead.
I just want to start out too by saying thank you to Samip for dropping all of that amazing knowledge. A lot of new things I learned, even about topics that I think I knew something about. There were just new aspects to otherwise familiar topics that were really fascinating. Couple of things, I think two main things were really striking to me that I'm really sort of ruminating on at this time. One was the idea of how Bhagat Singh Thind and Muhammad Ali, I was more familiar with Bhagat Singh Thind's case because that is, I think, of the, for me at least, limited history that I learned about, South Asians in the United States that long ago. I had heard of his case, but I wasn't, it struck me for the first time as you were telling the story of him and of Muhammad Ali, how much the language that they were using to kind of use the prejudices of the society in their favor, how much of that is so reminiscent of the rhetoric used by like white supremacists, eugenicists even, of, I'm currently reading Caste by Isabel Wilkerson, and she does a chapter on two of the foremost American eugenicists back in like the 1900s. And the language is just so parallel. And to me, that was really like, it gave me chills, just that kind of internalized oppression that would allow someone to take this like really hateful, like pseudo-scientific rhetoric and buy into it in order to get ahead. So that really struck me. And then the other thing, I'm just always looking for examples of just like real, genuine solidarity amongst the Black and South Asian communities in a historical, like I feel really proud that I see more and more examples of that this day and age. And what I hope for is that that continues, and even when movements rise and fall for a little bit, and then before they rise again, that we continue to stay in solidarity with each other and work towards towards equity. But it is always really exciting to me to learn about historical examples of that solidarity, because I hadn't learned about much of that. That's really much newer to me. I've only recently learned about the connections between Ambedkar and Du Bois. And just yesterday, I learned about the Dalit Panthers and the connections to the Black Panthers, and how there was just like real solidarity happening in all directions. The Black Panthers shouted out the Dalit Panthers in their national newspaper, and so it just I guess it doesn't surprise me that that history is not very widely taught, but it does kind of bother me anew every time. Like, man, I didn't even learn about this, and this is really important, and I didn't learn about this. But it feeds me. It makes me hungry to keep learning. And I think that's one of the, it's not enough, but it's really an important ingredient for showing solidarity, is to stay committed to knowing and learning more and more building upon the understanding that we have of history. And so what Samip shared about H.G. Mudgal and his connections to Marcus Garvey, that is brand new to me. I can't wait to go read up on that. So really appreciate having another example of solidarity between the Black communities and South Asian communities that I can, model my work and model my, as I teach my own kids, and work with colleagues and so forth. It's nice to have models to look up to, and it's nice to add another duo to the bank in H.G. Mudgal and Marcus Garvey. Thank you especially for sharing that, Samip.
Thank you. Thank you both for your incredibly thorough responses. I know one of my favorite things about events like this is not just what we learn from the presentation part or the initial discussion, but really hearing how the different life experiences that people have really help the information sink in different ways. And so, Rochelle, I really appreciated what you said about the global majority. I think that's something, and belonging to that versus wanting to belong to a smaller, seemingly more rosy group of people. I think that's something that I personally have been sitting with a lot and contemplating, just the breadth of it, kind of like you all were saying. And Caste is actually on my reading list as well. It is a book that I will actually read, as opposed to saying that I was going to read it and then find it on a list somewhere later. But what I think is also interesting about that book, and I don't believe this is going to give away spoilers, but the presence that the author includes about Judaism and anti-Semitic hierarchies and things like that as well. So I know this event is more about the interconnected histories related to the South Asian and the Black communities. And this, I obviously believe that is an incredibly important dialogue, but I really appreciate how novels like that, as well as, Samip, your presentation touched on just the intersectionalities between so many different communities and, intra and inter-community dynamics. So yeah, thank you all again for that. And I will turn it over to you, Samip, just if you wanted to reflect on just putting together the material, or if there was anything that particularly came up this time around when you were presenting it. I believe you're on mute.
Yep, thanks. I was just going to say that, yeah, I've shared these stories a number of times, but one thing that occurred to me relatively recently, I don't know if I should be embarrassed about this or not, but is that the theme that I think cuts across all of the stories is that every single individual that I talk about, Thind and Muhammad Ali, John Muhammad Ali, Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay, and even Dr. King, is faced with this moment where they can make a decision about whether they want to be in solidarity or whether they want to be in opposition. And so we see that Dr. King ultimately chooses the path of solidarity, obviously recognizing the shared struggles between African Americans and Dalits, and Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay as well. And others like Thind and John Muhammad Ali attempt to use their wealth or their religious status to basically attempt to differentiate themselves. And as I say in the presentation, that is ultimately consistently a losing argument, right? Like they never win that argument. And I think that's also what's so, hopefully, we begin to learn from these histories, because as history tells us that this is a decision that our community and individuals in our community continue to be faced with today. And ultimately, people make a decision. And I think what the histories can teach us is that the decision that we decide, when we take the decision in favor of solidarity, in favor of recognizing shared struggles, that is when ultimately we're able to transcend what is holding us down. And so, and like I said, it only occurred to me more recently how every single story has that moment of a decision that needs to be made, and how those two divergent paths kind of emerge from there.
Okay, thank you. So the next question I have is actually for Rochelle. So we recognize that you're an individual and you don't speak for the entirety of any community. But what have been, if you feel comfortable sharing in your personal capacity, in your work, within your legal background or as a healing justice practitioner, what have been productive instances of solidarity from fellow communities of color, either the South Asian community or other communities? And if you feel comfortable sharing, have you witnessed any negative or harmful interactions in the name of solidarity?
Thank you. Yes, I'll definitely share a couple of examples. And Samit, I just want to kind of build off what you shared too, because I think I'm really appreciating, especially the last 2 years, about how much of even my own experience is around racism and understanding caste systems as well, or organized around the politic of white purity, right? And how much that really just can really just essentialize who can be mobile in these systems, if at all, right? And so reflecting a lot on that and color and what's available to folks when even making those choices, right? Because as we know, some people can't even really effectively make those choices because they will be already categorized and cast, right? So I appreciate you bringing that point to the fore. I'm grateful to have a lot of both individual people in my life as well as different opportunities in community where I felt a lot of solidarity with South Asian folks. And, I do ask like why that is. Like it's because I know that there are a lot of people in the Black community who are suspicious of just folks who they believe sure, a range of people. And that's complex too, right? It's a little bit different to me than white identified folks who are suspicious of other people. But it does make me think about how important it was for me to even grow up in a community, though mostly white, did have a number of South Asian families and communities there that allowed me to build relationships early in my life, right? And that was really important because I began learning really, really early about, especially about, I had a number of friends who were Punjabi, so that was really helpful, and I continued to learn about different communities, people from different geographical locations, languages, among other things, right? So I need to continue to reflect on that and just like why is it that's the case, because it's not true for a number of Black people I know, especially Black people who grew up in majority Black communities. It's still, I think, hard for some folks to build deep and meaningful relationships, not only kind of at a communal or organizing level, but even like personally with folks who are not Black. And again, that's complex. But I am grateful for being in some majority white spaces insofar that allow me to find the other brown folks and to build that solidarity, right? Just a couple quick examples of some very recent solidarity work. Actually, there's some people like I know who are attendees right now who I do work with, so I'm really grateful to point that out in the work that we do, and feeling like a lot of folks, especially folks I've been building relationship with, have done a lot of deep work around understanding anti-Blackness, which is great, which has also invited me to learn more about caste systems. I have one friend in particular who is South Asian. We were friends and colleagues. This person comes, whose parents migrated, and who identify with the Brahmin caste. We've done some really beautiful pay equity work together, and both work professionally in trying to tell racial justice organizations and other social justice organizations that if you're really about racial equity, you really need to be investing in, it's actually in workplace reparations. That's what you need to do. But we also have configured that in our own like pay structure when we do work together, right? So that, to me, that's a deep form of solidarity when you're actually moving your own resources and materials to say, like, I understand that, you know, though my parents, you know, are immigrants, and I'm a second generation immigrant, and I'm a brown person, I understand still the economic structures that still allow my family to be a lot more materially wealthy than yours. And we were able to even get in our personal histories about, like, this happened the last 2 generations that have allowed our families to build wealth. We're not. So to me, that's a really moving form of solidarity that I am, I'm sure there's histories now, right? As I'm learning more about the presentation, I'm like, I wonder what forms of economic solidarity existed there too, which I'm sure did exist, which is really cool to think about. The one area, the one example I will speak very generally about, but is a form of, I think, so, like, potential solidarity, but that's really, really stuck now, is as was mentioned, I do folk healing work. So folk herbalism and folk medicine is an area that I work in. And there's some really rich, important conversations around co-optation and appropriation that have been ongoing and continue, and they're really important. So I'm involved in community, and there's been a lot of conflict, some of it generative, around talking about who can teach what. And on one hand, I think there's some deepening and understanding about, like, especially Arabic traditions, and who is actually, as a cultural context, to really speak to their traditions, even if you've trained or studied, but are not Desi or South Asian or someone else who comes from a cultural context in which that medicine is, like, lived and embodied, not only just studied. So that's, I think, an important conversation that I'm a part of now. And in some of those conversations, though, there's been examples of anti-Blackness that show up really subtly. And sometimes that has to do with conflating some of the really important questions about who can be an authority about what, with some implications that some people just aren't competent at all, or not able at all, or can't be self-determined to make decisions at all. And what is subtle about that is, like, both the aggressiveness of the questions, as well as some of the assumptions that are made, I know would never be made with a white teacher, even if they might be doing the same messed up thing around appropriation, right? But in this instance, what's happening to a Black woman. And I think what's been interesting is that we've been able to navigate some of that conflict by, like, making sure that we get really precise about the conversations and what we're talking about, and to just be very clear of, like, yes, to be in solidarity, we need to recognize this history and current reality of stolen knowledge and traditions, and that does not excuse these assumptions that are anti-Black and take away some very fundamental, like, assumptions about someone's competency or self-determination that is anti-Black, and we can't do that, right? So those are, like, some of the complicated, right, realities of being in solidarity. And I'm grateful that some folks are really here for those conversations and really here to do that hard work, that hard relational work, to understand precisely what we're meaning, precisely what we're doing together, that is historic and present. And I think we all need to be prepared to do that hard work, right, if we're actually going to be in solidarity together.
Thank you for that really beautiful and compound answer. I have so many things that I wrote down that I wanted to respond to in a quick period of time, but that's not going to happen because there are too many thoughts. But I really do appreciate the last point that you made around precision of identifying what to specifically talk about when navigating these conversations. I do think that is a tool that I will be putting into my belt as someone who's recently gotten into practicing insight meditation and in a lot of the centers, which I'm deeply grateful for. They're almost entirely just white, and as a white passing person who was born in India and is has a very rich South Asian cultural upbringing, it's always been like, how do I navigate this conversation? Because I don't know. I know I don't know enough. But there's an intangible, like, I cannot find the words to describe what to navigate specifically. And I think it's because the issue is really broad, and the lack of precision on identifying like what the actual barrier may be, and plenty of examples for that. But I will turn it over to Suruchi. Could you speak a little bit more about the work organizations like South Asians in Solidarity with Black Lives are doing, and how can members of the audience and the South Asian community in general contribute to your work or continue to show up for the Black community in actionable ways?
Sure. So the mission of South Asians in Solidarity with Black Lives, as you shared in the introduction, is to fight anti-Blackness and engage in active allyship by examining our roles in racist structures and then actively working to dismantle them. So what we do in our monthly meetings, we meet the first Saturday of every month for 90 minutes. We engage in reflective conversation, often based on a shared resource that many folks who join will have read or listened to. Currently, we're working on a several-month study of the book Caste by Isabel Wilkerson. And so we kind of unpack through conversation and reflection, and then follow up always with a focus on, okay, what are we going to do? What are we going to do that's small or big, but what's some action that we're going to take? One of my role models is the late Representative John Lewis. In fact, South Asians in Solidarity with Black Lives, I finally got the courage to like hit send on this like idea that I had right after Representative Lewis passed this past summer. He said, when you see something that is not right, you must say something, you must do something. Democracy is not an act. I'm sorry, democracy is not a state, it's an act. And so for that reason, our focus is on both the reflection and the like, what are we doing to dismantle these white supremacist structures that are holding everyone back, especially the Black community, but no one's benefiting. So a few things that we talk about doing. One is to have difficult conversations with family and friends. There's so much to work through in terms of anti-Blackness and in terms of casteism and colorism and our own position as people who have been historically marginalized and excluded, and also people who hold considerable privilege and to varying degrees, but we in the hierarchy that's set up in this country, we have relative privilege, and how can we use that in service of a more just society? So having those conversations is something that often comes up, amongst the group. Like, I want to have these conversations. They're so frustrating. Like, it doesn't seem like it might be worth the trouble because this family member seems too far, like, out of, like, it doesn't seem within their within reach to get them to any sort of meaningful point of progress. But pushing beyond that, this is a conversation that I feel really privileged to be able to have with family that's really close to me. My mom is an immigrant from India, and has some traditional views, and she also has some really progressive views, and this is one of the ways that I'm constantly trying to learn from her. We have conversations around like, how can we support other people my generation to talk to their family members who are your generation, Mom. So anyway, just having those conversations, even though it will be difficult, and even though there will be cultural aspects that are counter to, like in our family, it's just my mom and I have this joke of, everything. Oh, we don't talk about this. We don't talk about this. Mom, like, do you know where your do you know where so-and-so went to school? Oh, no, I don't know. It's like such a basic question. Why don't you know? But it's just that cultural thing in our kind of circle, in our cultural circle. And so, trying to work within that instead of writing people off and saying like they're never gonna change, figuring out what we can do to change our approach to kind of meet folks where they're at, and see if we can, maybe we won't get the person who's at this end of the spectrum to this end of the spectrum, but if we can kind of work systematically to get our people moving generally in the right direction, that's a start. So those difficult conversations are an important piece. But other than that, really following local Black-led organizations. There are so many amazing groups that are in need of our support in terms of time and resources and sustained financial action. As Rochelle was mentioning, that that economic solidarity can be such a huge, it can have such a huge impact. Also, engaging in mutual aid for food insecurity, medical care, especially with COVID going on right now, there's lots of mutual aid organizations that are working to address the inequities in the medical care that different communities are receiving. Signing petitions and joining protests, there's that work going on, whether it's in person or like on virtual platforms now. But there's so many things to make our voices heard about in terms of systemic inequities in education and housing, and again, medical care, policing. Standing up to racism in the workplace, that is a really, there's a lot of opportunity there, working to debunk that myth of the model minority. We can choose, we can make that choice to either coast off of that or to say, no, like I haven't done anything to deserve this, this preferential treatment, this like bias in my favor, and so I'm not going to accept it, and I'm going to hold my the community that I work with accountable for undoing that. Standing up to voter suppression efforts, actually committing to voting in every election all the time, and really just continuing to commit to learning the truth, the historical truth, because there's so many things that are just a part of our programming, right? That we can undo just by learning the things that we weren't taught and unlearning the things that we were taught that are flawed.
Thank you, Suruchi. You actually, the last point that you made ties it very well around learning the truth historically. Back to Samip. I just want to give you an opportunity to comment on either the work that SAADA is doing or ways that people can get involved, or kind of actions that you'd recommend from the perspective of uplifting historical voices.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think as Suruchi and Rochelle both said, really from the perspective of the work that SAADA does, of course, using storytelling using community history as an opening point for conversations that we need to be having today. And I really do think that, in knowing our community's histories of connection, of solidarity, like that really, to me, is an opening point for building those solidarities going forward. I had this really powerful experience a number of years ago, sharing stories about South Asian American history at a historical Black church in Philadelphia, and with an audience that didn't know anything about our community's histories. And I think by sharing and learning from each other, we found these points of connection that just really could, were an opening point for a building of deep relationships going forward. So, obviously I'm, very deeply invested in the work that SAADA does, but I really do think that these historical stories can be an opening point for conversations with parents, with loved ones, with family members that sometimes are a little more difficult to approach head on.
Okay, thank you. I really appreciate the range in suggestions that, not suggestions, but rather actionable steps that people can take, whether it's through multimedia and utilizing that as a gateway to have those difficult conversations, or I think bridging the economic gap in ways where it is possible is something that I'm surprised we don't hear about as much, especially in terms of the micro impact that an individual person can make. As well as, continuing to engage with literature and our histories and everything like that. So we do have about 15 minutes left in our allocated time. I want to open it up to question and answer. We have not seen anything in the chat at the moment, but we'll take this moment to let people ping questions in the chat. And if not, I have plenty more. But while we wait for that, do any of you have anything else that you wanted to speak on in terms of something that stood out to you that another panelist said, or just something that you may have, not mentioned already?
I can ask a quick question to Suruchi. I'm curious what led you to establish your group. I wonder if there was a catalyzing event or whether you just felt like this was just an important way to contribute to the solidarity of our movements and our communities.
Well, thanks for asking, Rochelle. So I really was looking for such a group. I felt like I wanted a group of like-minded folks who wanted to learn and who wanted to, hold each other accountable in meaningful ways and take action. And I couldn't find such a group, and I was hesitant at first to start it because I was like, who am I? Like, I'm not qualified to do this. And then I realized, yes, if it's not going to happen, unless I start it, then I am qualified to do it. And I don't, claim to have all of the answers. It's a group that I kind of set a very loose structure for, but there's so much opportunity for members of the group to, take sessions and run with them, or to, my only role is to make sure that we are continuing on with the work, that meetings are happening, that, there's reminders and encouragement for us to kind of keep plugging along with learning more and taking action. But then the group takes it from there.
Okay, thank you. We do have a couple questions coming in, so I will start. The first question we have is, how do we address or shift our community about making a choice, as Samip described? It seems like the majority of choices end up more like thinned and less like king.
I'd certainly be very interested to hear what Rochelle and Suruchi would say. For me personally, I think that the first step is to recognize that we are making these choices. One of the things that I found kind of interesting about Thin's story in particular is that for many people, even to this day, Thind is often seen as like a civil rights figure, right? Like he fought for, he fought for the South Asian community. He like took his case all the way to the Supreme Court. That was very much, in fact, how his story was told until more recently, until, like Dalit activists and academics and scholars forced us to re-examine and rethink how that case and that story was being told. And even, as I shared in the story, when people began to see it as a racist history, it often also wasn't seen as a casteist history as it is as well, and so really beginning to take a closer examination at the decisions that people are making and being honest about those decisions and ways that they are against solidarity and recognizing, once again, that we are making active decisions. We're not just bystanders in these. We're actively making decisions as individuals, as communities, and taking ownership for those decisions, I think, is really important.
I'll just quickly add, I think the way that we help people illuminate those choices to build off of what Samip mentioned is really, it's true for any kind of intersection of privileges that we might, exist in, right? So, though I'm Black and trans, I'm also a middle-class person, I'm an able-bodied person, and the more solidarity I've learned to be like in disability justice, to be in solidarity with poor people across the world, with folks who are also like doing work around land justice across the world, and a lot of these other interconnected communities. I think we learn something when we continue to be in solidarity in any kind of vector of our identities, how to make those choices, right? Like whether to believe history that we were taught, or to actually be interested in reclaiming histories and understanding, more radical histories, if we are actually in some deep relationship with people that we think we might have shared struggle with, but don't know as much about, if we actually make proactive steps to learn what those realities are. Those are the things that I think have helped me like transform and keep choosing towards solidarity. And then I think once you're in some meaningful relationships and practice around it, then you begin to see how similar these patterns around solidarity actually are, right? How to choose toward and bring people closer rather than to create that distance and try to other and pretend like we are protected somehow by that like our vulnerability is protected by denying that shared struggle. So I really appreciate that question, and I think it's a practice we all do every day.
Suruchi, is there anything you wanted to add? Totally fine if not.
I think just very quickly, I'll add just the framing around not making a choice is making a choice.
Mm.
I don't think I have to say too much more about that in the interest of time, but that is just a very, I think, just it's the nature of complicity, right? We think that's just the default, and so re-examining that.
Okay, thank you, all three of you. Thank you. I'm for the sake of time, I think we have room for maybe one more question, and I'll try and combine a couple of the ones that we have. So I will read. Actually, I'll just read all of the other questions that we have, and feel free to respond in the ways that you see fit. So how have the panelists, so how have you all dealt with pushback from the South Asian community about showing solidarity with Black and Brown communities? And then a parallel question is, do you think the model minority myth works against South Asians being able to align themselves with Black people?
I'll speak to the model minority myth. And I think the answer is yes, absolutely, that the model minority myth and that framework is absolutely a wedge that was created to create divisions between South Asians and other communities of color, especially Black communities. And it's also important to, complicate the stories that I've shared too, right? Like the Immigration Nationality Act of 1965, it certainly was in the midst of the civil rights era, and it was the act that allowed my family and many of our families to come to this country, but it was also very selective in who was allowed to immigrate to the United States. There was a preference given to quote unquote skilled immigrants, doctors, engineers. We have jokes about why there's so many South Asian American doctors, engineers. It was a very much a direct result of immigration policy in this country that was selectively deciding who should be allowed to come here and who should not be allowed to come here. And once again, the kinds of immigrants that were allowed into the country created a particular narrative about our community that was used in opposition to Black communities, right? The model minority myth of success, of education, of hard work by South Asians, by Asian Americans, used to hold other communities down. And so I think we have to actively fight against that framework. It is holding us down, it is holding all of us down. So absolutely, I think that is a damaging myth, damaging framework for us to examine.
I think I have a little less to say about the first question that was asked, because I can imagine there are a lot of people that I'm not in relationship with for those reasons, right? Connected to anti-Blackness, so I don't know, which is interesting, right? So I'm curious about whether Suruchi has like some insight into that, or Samip more than I do. I will say that I do think of the model minority myth as being somewhat analogous to the talented 10th, as we link, Du Bois and others, because the idea is that like there'll always be exceptional people, right, to our communities when we actually know in the aggregate, right, that like we kind of know the realities of most people, right. So I know that's cuts across caste and class as well, but I do think that all those myths are dangerous because it makes you believe that somehow you can be exceptional individually. And we just know how these systems work now. In 2021, we know how these systems work reliably, and we know how imperialism works. And it always has the same devastating consequences.
I will take a stab at the question on pushback from the South Asian community about showing solidarity with Black and Brown communities. For me, generally the sort of gap that I have observed is that there's like there's not a connection, there's not like a shared humanity, and so for me, that is generally the strategy, if that's what you want to call it, is to kind of get to the core of why does this seem like a theoretical conversation to you when people are attached to it? So bringing the whatever the source of the pushback is to life with if we're talking about like COVID, then sharing some of the harrowing statistics, sharing some like some individual stories that are that are familiar in some way, that people can relate to. Also, I think, a lot of that pushback I've observed comes from just the way the hierarchies are set up. We're meant to stay separated from each other. And so it's not, it's not knowing, it's perhaps not having any Black folks in your circle, in your family, your friends, your coworkers. And so my partner is Black, our kids are Black, and there are some aunties that I've been able to reach by them now knowing someone who means something to them through me, who has Blackness as part of their identity. And so in any way making it real, I mean, I'm not saying that like you should decide you know, what your family is going to be like in order to convince people in the South Asian community not to push back. But just saying, like, in making it not a theoretical idea, but you know, making it real, with, because they're real stories and real people who are connected to policies and other things that we want the members of the community to be more aware of.
Okay, well, we are exactly at 8. And for a gathering with a lot of South Asian people, to be on time is a strange feat, but you know, we'll take it. So I do want to say thank you once again to all of you, Suruchi, Samip, and Rochelle, for joining us today, and for Samip preparing the presentation, and you know, just everybody that was able to attend, for being here, and those that have stayed on, for staying on throughout the duration of the event. I believe Nisha just put a link to our site on the chat. So if you would like to learn more about our work from Desis for Progress and make a donation, you can do all of that from the website. We are an entirely volunteer-led organization and are entirely grassroots funded. So any support would be appreciated. And I would like to thank Otter Transcriptions as well for providing the transcript for this, while the captioning feature did not plan out the way that we wanted. And finally, I'd like to just take a really quick moment to allow the 3 of you to plug any social media channels or websites. We will, or you can put them in the chat. We will include this in our follow-up email, but anything that you wanted to say, we'll give you the space to do that before we close out.
I just wanted to thank Rochelle and Suruchi. I learned so much from both of you. And so I'm really just so grateful to be part of this conversation. Joy and Nisha and Desis for Progress, I want to thank you again for inviting me to be here today. Sorry, that was like an anti-plug, but that's what I was feeling. So.
Well, I want to just echo that. I'm really grateful to have been a part of this group, and I would invite anyone who's interested to join the conversations on the first Saturday of every month, 1:30 Eastern, and I'll put the website in the chat in just a second.
Yeah, I would love to keep talking, so I hope we can do that over email. It's been a great connection that you all made for us, so thank you so much. I'm so eager also to look at the presentation again, so thank you for making that available for all of us to learn more things. And Desis for Progress, thanks for having me back. I think this is the 3rd year in a row we're having a conversation about solidarity movements and moving through anti-Blackness, so thank you for continuing this relationship. And yeah, I just would encourage folks to support the work that you all do.
Thank you. And with that, I hope everyone has the rest of, well, I hope everyone has a good rest of their evening and a safe and restful weekend. So thank you so much. We will be in touch.